Hi, everyone. Sorry I can't be there today. I had something come up and I can't join you, but I wanted to talk to you real quick about what we've got going on here in the college when it comes to using drones to do journalism. Some of you have heard me talk about this before, but what I'm talking about is using small unmanned systems, not like big military things. If you thought military when you heard the word drones, get that out of your head. What we're talking about is things like this: very small, light, easy to control devices that can get several hundred feet in the air and get video or photo of a news event. So think about things like tornadoes or floods. We've had several floods in the area in the last few years that have been ideal to cover with these. Um, just to give your readers a different perspective on an event. These things are very easy to fly. They're really inexpensive. This one's about $500. Put a camera on the front. I don't have one on here right now, but it would go in this little plastic thing right there. A GoPro runs you about 300 bucks. So you're talking about an $800 aerial photography platform. So if you were, say, in Wayne, I believe it was last spring when a tornado went through part of town, you could have been up in the air within minutes and had some pretty amazing photography of just what went on and shown people throughout the region exactly what happened and what was damaged and where the tornado went. It's a common occurrence here in the Great Plains of America that tornadoes come down here about this time of year and cause a lot of damage. So these are what I believe is an ideal platform to be doing this kind of work. But that said, not everybody shares my enthusiasm for this, least of all the FAA. The FAA, excuse me a moment, sent me a nasty little note here that says I can't fly outside. Currently, under Federal Aviation Administration policy, now let me stress the word policy, you cannot use an unmanned aerial system for journalism, for anything really that is a commercial purpose. So aerial photography companies can't use them, farmers can't use them, real estate brokers can't use them. Now, that's not to say that isn't going on. It isn't going on in fairly widespread use. There are all kinds of commercial companies using them for different purposes. But the FAA says that it is banned, that the only way that you can fly these things for a commercial purpose is to ask permission from the FAA, and the FAA will tell you no. The answer is no. The reason I was stressing policy is because this policy is under assault from the courts. There are various problems with this. The FAA actually fined a drone pilot. His name is Raphael Perker. He was filming a promotional video for the University of Virginia, and they fined him $10,000. And he fought it in an administrative law court in Washington, and the judge actually agreed with him. And what the judge said was, the FAA doesn't have real policy. They have a real regulation. They have a policy guidance memo, and they have some voluntary guidelines from the 1980s. And they've been able to kind of morph that into this law enforcement style practice of enforcing rules and fining people and threatening criminal prosecution for flying these things. The judge says you don't have that. You never went through the process. You never proposed rules. And indeed, Congress in 2012 actually mandated that they make regulation to allow for the use of unmanned systems in the national airspace. So even Congress recognizes there's not really rules on the books about this, but the FAA is acting as if there is. The judge invalidated that. Judge said that their definition of aircraft was pretty ridiculous. The FAA was basically claiming jurisdiction over anything that flies, regardless of how it flies. The judge in his ruling actually somewhat lampooned that, saying you're now saying that under this definition you have federal regulatory authority over balsa wood airplanes that you can buy at the grocery store and that kids throw around. A few of us kind of watching this kind of made our own jokes about this and said, well, a pass from a quarterback in the NFL is now an FAA regulated aircraft. Or the one that a personal favorite of mine, it wasn't mine, somebody else did it, was bullets. Bullets from guns are now FAA-regulated aircraft, and I don't think the Second Amendment crowd is going to be really thrilled about that one. So The FAA appealed this ruling within 24 hours, which basically set us back to status quo. And since then, we have seen the FAA go in and stop the Washington Nationals baseball team, which was using actually this very device right here to fly over its spring training practices and film outfielders shagging fly balls, and the FAA shut them down. The FAA is also investigating two citizen journalists who filmed news events in New York City. One, a building collapse in East Harlem, and the other one, a fire at a recycling plant. And so the FAA has returned to status quo. Their response or their appeal brief is due soon, any day now, and we expect to see a response from that in a month. And a judge will rule. Now, this will, regardless of the outcome, it's almost certainly going to go to federal court. It will probably go beyond there. But that leads us to our next kind of major deadline in this, and that's something that I want you, as the NPA, to really start to pay attention to, which is the FAA has said that as soon as November, they're going to release a notice of proposed rulemaking, which is the first step in the regulatory process. They're going to say, we are going to show you the rules we intend to issue for unmanned systems. If you are interested in using a drone to do a story, even something as simple as the county fair or tornado damage, anything like that, you should pay attention to these rules, because the FAA has hinted at what those rules might include, and some of them could be very onerous. Some of them could be actually pretty hostile to First Amendment interests. So the FAA is talking about having people be licensed, and what level of training they're going to have is up in the air. It may be fairly expensive, and it may be fairly onerous. And frankly, that's not necessary for something as small as this. I can teach you how to fly this thing in about 4 hours. They're talking about requiring insurance, which actually makes some sense. They're talking about flight restrictions. Depending on how far they go, that could be sensible, or it could be onerous, and people will end up ignoring it, which is not good. They're talking about background checks for pilots. They're talking about all kinds of restrictions that might come out. Those of us in journalism need to be paying attention to these things, because there are First Amendment principles at work here. The courts have routinely held that photography is speech, it's expression, and that we have a right to photograph in a public place. That's why we can send photographers to a news event and not have to worry about the law or anything like that. We have a right. We have a First Amendment right to do that. A real question exists is, how far does that right to photograph extend up? How high in the air does it go? So depending on what the FAA does, we might have to take a real hard look at that and ask those very questions. We won't know until maybe November, maybe later than that, but this is something that people who care about press freedoms really need to start paying attention to. Sorry, slight scene change later. The second thing I want to talk to you about real quick is state legislatures. We, as news organizations, do pay attention to our state legislatures, but as people who love the First Amendment, who rely upon it, we really need to start paying attention to state legislatures' efforts to regulate drones if we want to use them as a news gathering tool someday. Here in Nebraska, last legislative session, there was a bill introduced that was going to restrict law enforcement use, but there was a lot of advocacy to extend that beyond law enforcement to private and commercial uses. That the bill ended up not going anywhere, and it wasn't, I don't believe it was reintroduced this session, and there wasn't time for it. But it's floating around out there, and there are interests that would seek to restrict drone use. Now, Nebraska is not the first, and they're not alone. The state of Texas actually passed a bill that makes it a misdemeanor crime to photograph from a drone above a height of 8 feet. So without the consent of the landowner, I should say. So what that means is that if you're a news photographer in Texas and you take a drone and you fly up just 10 feet in the air and you take a picture of the downtown Dallas skyline, a photo that's been taken countless times, you now have to get consent of every visible landowner in the frame. Where if you did it from the ground, you would have no such responsibility. If you put your camera on the end of a pole that went 20 feet in the air, you wouldn't have that responsibility. If you got on a manned helicopter and went 500 feet in the air, you would not have that same responsibility. But the state of Texas wanted to make drones basically a misdemeanor crime. Idaho has made it civilly actionable to photograph from a drone. There are 4 other states that are considering laws that would restrict private and commercial drone use, though mostly dealing with private property and privacy issues. But all of those bills suffer from a real lack of definitions that would clearly delineate news gathering as a constitutionally protected form of speech, that would protect journalists from being seen as criminals, and it's a little bit disturbing. So we need to be watching our state legislature here about that. We need to be advocating for our First Amendment rights, even though they may not be crystal clear. The courts have granted journalists a right to photograph in public places. That's why we can go shoot pictures of sporting events or things going on Main Street. It's part of our constitutional rights. But a real question exists is how far does that right to photograph in a public place extend up in the air? A lot of that has been predicated around the photographer being on the ground. Well, the photographer no longer has to be on the ground. So these are some questions that are out there. But if we want to use these as a news gathering device, we have to be mindful of attempts to limit our freedoms. That's not to say that we have an absolute First Amendment right to use these. I have lots of journalist friends who like to believe we have an unassailable, undeniable First Amendment right to use these things, use drones to do journalism, and that's not the case. What I would tell you is that my little drone over there is the modern equivalent of shouting fire in a crowded theater. That courts have generally recognized limits on speech that are based in safety, and they're called reasonable place and time restrictions. So drones can they fly, and they have rapidly spinning blades, and they can crash, and they can hit people in the head, and they can hurt them. So to say that it should just be a free-for-all is folly. But that's not to say that some legislators aren't looking to go a little bit too far. If you are interested in what we're doing, you can go to the Drone Journalism Lab's blog, which is at dronejournalismlab.org. You can email me at the email address on the screen. And thanks for tuning in. And I'm sorry I can't be there to be with you today. See you all down the road somewhere.